Strange and terrifying facts behind Arab slave trading. The word slave carries with it a weighty history of raids, incarceration, and trading of human beings, particularly those of Black African descent, including men and women. The development of Islam in the 7th century paved the way for a number of invasions, whose primary objective was to establish Islam as the one and only legitimate religion. These campaigns gave birth to the typical post-war occurrences, such as plundering and seizing slaves, but they also gave rise to new opportunities. The Islamic religion's sphere of influence expanded to the east of the Arabian Peninsula, as well as into large parts of the southwest of North Africa. The acquisition of sovereignty over these large regions opened up enormous opportunities to capture and sell slaves of African descent who lived south of the Sahara Desert. The growing economic activity in the West resulted in a greater demand for low-cost labor, which turned out to be one of the primary driving forces for the expansion of the slave trade in Europe and the Americas. The number of people who were captured and sold into slavery in Africa increased dramatically from the 7th century until the 19th century. Based on the findings of several researchers, the number of people who were captured and sold into slavery during this time period is estimated to be between 11.5 and 14 million, and it is shocking to know the terrifying facts behind Arab slave trading. 7 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, in 639, Islam made its way into North Africa with the assistance of 4,000 warriors invading from Mecca. However, Islam later fled south in fear of the Byzantine navy, which was predominantly Christian. On their way south, Islam discovered the city of Cairo in the process of looking for it. From slaves had been transported along the same path by the Egyptians from ancient times. It was common knowledge that slaves were brought northward from Central Africa. This route had been used by the Egyptians. But how exactly did the Arabs make advantage of these pathways? To accomplish this, the Arabs would travel through the Sahara Desert with black slaves that they had captured in the heart of Africa, and then sell them to civilizations in the Mediterranean and the Heart East. The majority of these came from the Canaan-Borneo Empire up until the 8th century, and then from the Mali Empire between the 13th and 15th centuries. The dark-skinned Arabs of the north frequently differentiated themselves from the lighter-skinned slaves by referring to themselves as Zanji, which is equivalent to the word Sudan, which means black. Were they the only two paths that the Arabs traveled? In point of fact, no. Slaves were also carried eastward to India and China through India from the island of Zanzibar, which is located close to where modern-day Tanzania is today. These routes were the most popular and profitable ones. After conquering the Swahili coast with the local traders, Muslim kings began engaging in the business of slave dealing. These merchants took the Bantu people of Africa, most commonly known as the Zanji, and brought them to their lands in modern-day Kenya, Mozambique, and Tanzania. They were gathered close to the coast with significant numbers in the islands of Maguja and Pemba, and were eventually sold off to the east, possibly through Madagascar, while sailing the Indian Ocean. Between the 8th and 17th centuries, an average of 1,000 slaves were traded each year. However, by the end of the 18th century, this number had increased to 4,000. When we hear the word slave, an image of a black guy immediately comes to mind. However, African Zanji people were not the only sort of slaves that the Arabs acquired and sold in the past. Between the 16th and the 19th centuries, a group of sovereign entities that came to be known as the Barbary States carried out regular slave-taking expeditions all the way from Italy to Iceland in order to capture white people in the Netherlands, Ireland, and South Britain. The states of Algeria, Tunisia, and Etania, which is now known as Tripoli, were all involved in these trades, which took place along the Barbary coast of North Africa. These white slaves were accorded a better status than the black slaves, and some of them even went on to achieve higher positions of power. This privilege was not afforded to the black slaves during their enslavement. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, it is believed that the Barbary pirates in North Africa were responsible for the enslavement of over 1 million Europeans. The spread of slave markets to other regions of the world was an unavoidable consequence of the general anarchy that prevailed during the Middle Ages in Europe, the Middle East, and other areas of the world. slaves were already being exported from the island of Zanzibar to both India and China. Historians assert that they have evidence of black slaves being transported all the way to Japan. The Tang dynasty in China, whose royals purchased a significant number of European and Jewish slaves, is one example of a documented instance of the purchase of slaves by their owners. People also tell stories of Yasuke, the first black samurai, who came to Japan as a slave with missionaries, but ended up on the good side of Oda Nobunaga, who ended up placing him on retainer. Yasuke entered Japan with the missionaries. People also tell stories about Yasuke. Historians dispute the notion that Yasuke was acclaimed as a samurai and instead assert that he was only inducted as a warrior in the feudal army. This is despite the fact that the more prevalent discourses state that Yasuke was a samurai. Muslim operations would also reach northern India and modern-day Pakistan through the Middle East or Central Asia on their way to the east, where roughly 100,000 people were taken as slaves by raiders. Despite the fact that certain regions were already occupied by a tiny number of people who followed Islam, those individuals were murdered, and their families were forced into servitude. A good number of us didn't particularly enjoy studying history in school. In our schools and universities, we learned a great deal of information regarding slaves, including how people obtained them and where they were sold. People, while debating the subject of slavery, would only accuse Arabs or Europeans of forcing black people into slavery through fighting, so absolving all other groups of responsibility for the institution. What the vast majority of people don't realize is that many times black people were sold off to Arabs by their own kin in exchange for some payment or to settle debts. This is something that most people are unaware of. In Africa throughout the Middle Ages, it was highly common for black monarchs or landowners to hold slaves, which they would eventually sell off to Arabs. These slaves were eventually sold to the Arabs. The inconvenient fact is that the rulers of Middle Africa played a role similar to that of middlemen, by, among other things, gathering up people from neighboring communities and selling them to the Arabs for a profit. Ibn Battuta, a Berber explorer, once traveled to the ancient African kingdom of Mali. During this trip, he made the observation that individuals living in neighboring communities with fewer slaves were looked down upon with contempt. Ibn Battuta was also given a slave child as a gift during this trip. The most common and widespread means of enslaving people was through war. After conquering an area, warlords would march the conquered people back to their own borders, where they would either sell them as slaves or offer them up for sale to the highest bidder in the states that were nearby. In addition, the Arabs utilized a variety of methods in order to kidnap children in Africa. One of these methods involved enticing the children into traps with the promise of dates, after which the youngsters were sold off in Arab lands. As is common knowledge, Africa is the continent with the greatest quantity and variety of mineral resources. At that particular period in history, the most important imports into Africa were items of clothing and food, while the most important exports were slaves, coconuts, and gold. Slavery was rampant throughout Africa in the Middle Ages, and black African monarchs often played the role of middleman, gathering up people from neighboring communities so that they could be sold to Arabs for profit. War was yet another means by which individuals were enslaved. Warlords would capture their enemies and then sell them as slaves. Dates were used as bait to lure children into the Arabs' traps so that they may be captured during the Arab conquest of Africa. Slaves were put to work in a variety of capacities across Africa due to the continent's abundance of mineral resources. These tasks included irrigation, mining, transportation, and public works. Do not forget to subscribe and turn on post notifications to be the first to know when the next post is up. The use of male slaves for strenuous labor was common practice, while women were frequently enslaved for the sole purpose of having more children. Female slaves endured anguish that was considerably greater than male slaves, and they were also sometimes castrated. The Mediterranean region and the areas that surrounded it were the most notable centers of the slave trade, with major slave trading hubs located in Morocco, Algeria, Tripoli, and Cairo. This part in general sheds light on the intricate workings of the Arab slave trade, illuminating a sad fact regarding the role of black rulers and the cruel treatment of captives. The Swahili coast was a major center for the slave trade, and the local people were directly involved in the practice of kidnapping and selling indigenous people. Even though it was mostly controlled by European colonizers, the West Coast, also known as the Gold Coast or the Ivory Coast, was notorious for its slave trade. Slaves who were part of the Arab slave trade were subjected to horrible living conditions. Yet in contrast to their Christian counterparts, slaves who were governed by Islamic law were granted some rights. Despite this, they nevertheless endured a great deal of suffering, and many of them perished while making the perilous voyage through the Sahara Desert. Slaves were forced to perform backbreaking work in hazardous environments, and if they fell short of their master's demands, they were punished with harsh treatment. The documentary also sheds light on modern-day slavery, which reveals that the practice is still carried out in several parts of the world, with persons being exploited for the purpose of gaining either personal or commercial advantage. The situation of Yemen, which is seeing a growing slave population due to the political unrest in the country, is emphasized as an example. Slaves subjected to strange punishments. Shocking. Click on the next video to find out more.